War is the systematic loss of human potential at the behest of destruction. And yet there are certain people in society that not only profit from war, but also thrive off of the prospect of war due to the various stakes they have in conflict, both financial, moral, and also social. And in this video, I intend to address that class of people and to talk about a industry that is well known to many of you in the sound of my voice and may not be so well known to others, called the military-industrial complex, which is basically the big umbrella under which this war profiteering, both again in financial sense and the social sense, occurs. Because as America and as the West right now marches closer and closer and closer towards a prospect of World War III. I'm not what they call a doomer, but I am a realist, and I understand that right now we are on a pathway to a very bad end if the situation in the Middle East gets worse. And starting with also what we did with Ukraine, funding a proxy war on Ukraine and basically dumping entire supply chains of ammunition into that country and putting moral support behind a regime that many of us understand is not the most up to snuff with American standards or even NATO standards, which is why Ukraine was not admitted into NATO in the first place. As this conflict continues to brew across the world, we have to really ask ourselves, are these conflicts being fought for the virtuous and noble purposes that people in NATO, people in think tanks funded by NATO and funded by war interests are saying? Or is there something darker and deeper? And I say there is. Now, I'm not simply going to talk to you about the military-industrial complex, although I will. I'm going to talk about how this philosophical phenomenon called the society of status uses the military-industrial complex to attack the foundations of Western civilization. So this is going to be a very high-level video, but I want to start by first analyzing what many of you do know, which is indeed the military-industrial complex and its impact on American society. Now, many Americans were first awakened to the term military-industrial complex during Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address, where he basically warned, and I'll play a little bit of it for you right now, that the military-industrial complex, this merger between private and military interests, could potentially be a big threat to America.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
And ever since he said that, now, there are so many commentators that will cite that speech as their first point of waking up and understanding what's going on. And I think Dwight D. Eisenhower had the right idea, the correct idea, and unfortunately his fear came true in the worst ways. The truth is this: the military-industrial complex not only exercised control in the days of Dwight D. Eisenhower, they exercised more control and more influence over American society by hitting three theaters of influence. They exercised control over American society, number one, through schooling, number two, through the media, number three, through politicians, and number four, through entertainment and movies. And that is how this very strong industry has been able to be such a force multiplier in American politics. But we must ask ourselves, before we examine the theaters of control of the military-industrial complex, what exactly is the military-industrial complex? The military-industrial complex, for those of you who do not know, is essentially this merger between government interest and financial interest that benefit when the weapons of war are produced. So we're talking about defense contractors, talking about people that build warplanes, people that build military rifles that are almost exclusively always used either for war or in preparation for war. So these defense contractors, if there is no war, lose a very significant source of their business. I think the term defense contractor is actually an oxymoron, because if these people were solely working in defense of the country, then their scope and their control over the discourse and education of our nation would actually be much smaller than it actually is. But that's a different story, different day. And so this merger of interest is not just situated to work on the particular issue of warfare and defense. It also establishes legitimacy by manufacturing consent amongst the populace through subversive and also direct means. So as I mentioned, there are 4 theaters of control of the military-industrial complex. Let's start with schooling. When in American education, when wars are taught about, whether it be World War II, Vietnam, the incidences that are suspicious or that the government tried to cover up, like, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which actually compelled Americans to go into Vietnam, and which actually was covered up by the government and was actually manipulated by the government to do that, that is never talked about when it comes to certain wars. In fact, the Vietnam War is never really talked about beyond the fact that Americans went into Vietnam to fight communism and we lost. That is the narrative that is taught in public schools in America, and that is the narrative that so many Americans from cradle to the grave have about Vietnam. Every single other detail that indicts the sort of interventionist sensibility that brought Vietnam to the forefront of Americans in the first place and sent so many American men and women to their slaughter in the first place is never discussed, because that is inconvenient. In fact, discussing warfare and discussing American interventionism in a negative way is fundamentally inconvenient to the military-industrial complex, because it causes the populace to be suspicious of all future wars. This is one of the reasons why the term Vietnam syndrome was so prominent in the aftermath of Vietnam during the Cold War, where the possibility of not just warfare, but nuclear warfare was on the horizon, even more so than it is today. You had people like someone I respect, Ronald Reagan, saying that Americans need not be stricken with Vietnam syndrome just because basically we did bad in Vietnam does not mean that every other war will be a fruitless pursuit. We should actually be excited for America to have a more interventionist role in the world and to beat communism. And Vietnam syndrome is just an example of the military-industrial complex and its agents trying to pathologize the American people because they have a healthy suspicion towards war. That's literally all it was. Because Vietnam syndrome actually kind of caused the bluff of Vietnam, which was supposed to be some kind of moral crusade, which was absolutely disastrous and did nothing more than cause a lot of harm and damage to American soldiers and also to American reputation. It caused the bluff of the entire purpose of Vietnam, but then tries to say, well, you're taking that one situation and you're applying it to all wars. No. Vietnam shows very clearly what going into a war with the wrong intentions, with a lack of an ethos that is based in national self-preservation, and that is more so based in chasing ideas, chasing false visions of ideas that come from some institute around the world. It shows the folly of that. It shows the folly of internationalist interventionism. And for that reason, but you understand, the military-industrial complex benefits from the ethos of international interventionism, because where there is a demand, there will be a supply. If there is a demand for war, the military-industrial complex can supply it. And one of the ways they make sure their supply goes by without a hitch is by pathologizing the public and getting them to be more attuned to war, by manipulating their patriotism, manipulating their love for their country, and tuning it towards the destruction of far-off enemies that are, in all reality, just abstract versions of boogeymen, more often than not created by the establishment trying to destroy them. Look at Gaddafi. Look at Castro. Look at almost every single dictator in recent history. And you will, I promise you, if you look deeper, you will find a money trail going right from Washington into their bank accounts. But the media as well, and this is really what concerns me, is primarily one of the agents of the warfare complex. In fact, it's even called the military media industrial complex, because so many wartime correspondents, so many people that are actually called on to cable news to speak about war actually have some connection with the defense establishment or have some connection with the military industrial complex. And even if the commentators themselves don't have a connection, many media organizations are influenced heavily by the military industrial complex. So for example, look at NBC. NBC, which is of course this big news network, has MSNBC underneath it as a subsidiary. During the Gulf War in 1991, NBC, who was owned by General Electric, which is actually one of the biggest producers for the Pentagon, for both the Iraq War and the Gulf War in 1991, where we went in to go deal with Hussein, NBC was actually speaking in glowing terms about the Gulf War. So for example, during the onset of the Gulf War, Tom Brokaw, according to the organization FAIR, which monitors media bias, echoed the White House and a frequent chorus from the U.S. journalists by telling viewers, and I quote, "We must point out again and again that it is Saddam Hussein who put these innocents in harm's way." And Ted Koppel of ABC said that great efforts are taken, sometimes at great personal cost, to American pilots, that civilian targets are not hit. Then Brokaw, NBC, went back and offered more apologia for the warfare happening in the Gulf, saying that the U.S. has fought this war at arm's length and with long-range missiles, high-tech weapons to keep casualties down. So why are so-called objective reporters saying that America is doing everything it can to keep casualties down? Is it because it's the truth? Well, it may be the truth, but that's separate, besides the point. It's an attempt to manufacture consent to make it seem as if you can point to a civilian death that happened due to an airstrike undercarried out by America, you can say with plausible deniability that America is not actually trying to do it, and therefore they eschew moral blame. Even though the actions led to the death of someone, you can easily say, well, they're not trying to do it, therefore the moral blame is not on us. We're trying not to have this thing happen, you see? And Brokaw and Koppel were basically being mouthpieces for the military-industrial complex in that sense. If you look at the bombing of Yugoslavia, the Kosovo affair in the late 1990s, there was so much from NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, New York Times. Almost all of them were singing the praises of the warrior's perspective. Almost all of them were. For example, the New York Times said this: NATO began its second month of bombing against Yugoslavia today with new strikes against the military targets that disrupted civilian electrical and water supplies. This was the first words of the lead article on the New York Times front page on the last Sunday in April 1999, which basically said that America was trying to deal with military targets, not civilian targets. Even though them attacking military targets hurt civilians, they say military targets to, again, try to make it seem as if America is trying to help the civilians or avoid hurting them, even though the actions of the war are hurting them. And of course, this entire affair was not just America, it was NATO as a whole. These are just a few examples of how the media acts as a mouthpiece for the military-industrial complex. And also, let's look at, for example, the Pentagon's military analyst program. So the Pentagon actually had, and still does in my opinion, but officially had a military analyst program. In 2002, it was launched by the Assistant Secretary of Defense Public Affairs, and the goal was to, and I quote, to spread the administration's talking points on Iraq by briefing retired commanders for network and cable television appearances. Now, these commanders were presented as independent commentators, when in all reality, they were being given talking points from the Pentagon, from the Department of Defense, to literally, again, manipulate the public to war in favor of war. These were not independent analysts. And these people were all over the cable news spectrum, beating the war drum against Saddam Hussein, promoting the war on terror, and this was exposed, ironically enough, by the New York Times, an organization that has been complicit in the sort of wartime propaganda pushed out by the DoD. And after that, the DoD officially closed the network. Now let me say something here. If you look at a lot of wartime commentators, even some that are talking about the current Israel war right now, with Israel and Hamas, a lot of them have an overwhelming connect to financial interests that benefit directly from those wars happening. If you look at almost any of these big-time commentators, they are not independent. Even if they're not connected with the Pentagon, a lot of them have some stake or operated in the system that had some stake for this to happen in the first place. And this is another problem that has been noted. The media relies so much on official sources, official narratives to establish the truth about what's happening in a war. But when those official sources are government sources, and we understand the government is not some impartial god, it is in fact a political entity that, depending on who inhabits it in that period of time, has an interest in information being directed towards a certain course, and that course is often contrary with the truth. If we're going to accept that, then why in the world would an official source be any better than some random person on the street? Because we've associated, and this is the problem I talked about at the beginning of my video, we have associated status for truth. We've associated aesthetics for substance. And by associating aesthetics for substance, we have effectively shoehorned our ability to understand the truth for how it is. And we have bound ourselves to a perpetual cycle of association. If I see something that comes from, like, say, the New York Times or the DoD, because I already believe those sources are official and they are valid, anything that comes from them, I am more prompted to believe than if it comes from Joe Blow on the internet. But you should have the same level of skepticism, perhaps even more, towards government official sources that you would Joe Blow on the internet. Just because it's official does not mean it's correct. And when you consider the prevalence of political influence and control when it comes to crafting narratives, you should be even more scared, even more aware. But the corporate media doesn't care about any of that. They also exercise influence through entertainment. Many of the movies that many of you know and love have been manufactured with direct input from the Pentagon. The Pentagon has an entertainment liaison officer that works in Hollywood, has been there for decades. And they help make movies like Transformers, Revenge of the Fallen, Lone Survivor, The Perfect Storm, The Day the Earth Stood Still, the TV show Bones, 24, some John Wayne movies, The Green Berets, From Here to Eternity, The Devil's Brigade, The Last Ship, Lone Survivor, Godzilla. The Pentagon has their fingerprints all over all of these productions. I can keep going on. What's the... Oh, I almost missed one. How about defense contributions? The defense industry gives $51 million per year, or at least in 2020. They gave $51 million to both Democrats and Republicans to promote things that were conducive towards war. Lockheed Martin, of course, gave $6 million. That's total contributions. Raytheon gave $5 million. Northrop gave $5 million. General Dynamics gave $3 million. It goes on and on and on and on. This is in 2020, the last election cycle. Why in the world are defense contractors who are meant to help defend the homeland, if you look at their name, financing politicians to work on their behalf? Once again, it's a military media industrial complex, it's a military entertainment industrial complex, and it's a military political industrial complex that benefits from one course of action happening. This is the problem. Now, how does this fit into the society of status that I mentioned earlier? Very simply, the society of status was this old world relic, which America was a fundamental repudiation of, that basically said, I can assess the value of something, both social, moral, and political value, all those three theaters of value, by looking at what it's associated with or looking at what title it has. So if you were from in old world Europe, if you were from a noble house, you were born at the top of the feudal system. If you were from a poor family, you were born at the lowest rung in the feudal system, and your value as a human being and everything else that follows that as that human being value would be classified in those terms. It was a form of determinism that the individual could not break free from because status had this sort of overpowering idea. But in the New World, America said, hold on, status is an inferior way to approximate the human being. You guys hear me? It's an inferior way to understand the glory of the human being, to understand human potential, which is really, if we're going to understand morality, we have to understand what actions are best for life to proceed and not just proceed. That's the baseline. That's the thin conception, as we would say in ethics, but also to flourish, the thick conception. And you cannot consider either of those questions without asking the question, what political conditions are good for humans to flourish? And you don't get good political conditions for flourishing unless you acknowledge that man is a free agent, vested with free will, capable of using that in a rational way in a voluntary society. This was the conclusion the New World Americans came to. It's why the Declaration of Independence exists. It's why natural law was such a massive force in the formation of the American Republic, because all of these new, not really new, but these sort of ideas that were formulated in a new way came to capture the imaginations of people that wanted to be morally flourishing individuals. So the New World said that status is bad in the sense that it does not determine anything. Our own behavior, our self-reliance, that determines things. And yet, the society of status that was rejected so powerfully by the formation of the American Republic has so quickly came back in the form of so many different things, whether it be universities, these Ivy League universities, or the military-industrial complex, to name two examples. It has come back with a vengeance and has promoted propaganda and the manipulation of information, all for status. Those military analysts that were supposed to be independent, that work for the Pentagon, you know why they did it? They were promised special access. Access is status. It's a particular status that gives you special privilege to see something. They were promised access. They wanted to be inside the room. And so they did that. The society of status encourages moral blind spots that if you didn't operate under that framework, you would be able to see clearly and avoid them. But not only that, the society of status phrases things in terms of what is as opposed to what should be. There's a lot of people that will say, well, America has a duty to be a force in the world. Well, America has a duty to have a strong military. Well, America has a duty to do X, Y, and Z for national security. And I'm not saying that any of these things, I am saying that one of these things is incorrect. But what I'm really trying to say is that all of those sentences, the one thing they have in common is that all of them are conceived on this idea that America should have an unchallenged role in the world, that if we don't have that role in the world, we are somehow doing something that is morally wrong. The American public has been convinced that if America is not somewhere fighting some enemy, no matter how abstract the enemy, that we are somehow in some moral rut, we're somehow being less than what we are. We're somehow not being fulfilling our potential as Americans or as a country, and we're giving the world over to disorder or being isolationists, all this stuff. These are thought-terminating cliches that don't really expect you to look outside of their purview and really think, okay, what does it mean for America to have a role in the world? What does it mean if America's role in the world distracts from its role for its citizens? Should a country's role in the world be more than its dedication to its citizens and its own borders? What does all this mean? Instead of engaging in the Socratic process where knowledge is really found and discovered, these thought-terminating cliches just box in the American people and make us think in very simplified terms about rather consequential matters. We must be a society of truth seekers that don't fall prey to the tyranny of rhetoric and the tyranny of cliches that may try to convince you by way of association and indoctrination and education and schooling through your entire life that America has XYZ role, we should always be asking ourselves in our hearts, what is the role of our country? And then weighing that against sound philosophy, not making assumptions based off of habituation of words. And yet, in a society of status, those phrases, those thought-terminating cliches, they are so consequential. Why? Because your status, your access, your privilege rests entirely on your ability to toe the line and not to actually find the truth. The military-industrial complex is the result of a philosophical corruption of the human being to be a slave to status and an enemy to inquiry, to be a slave to passion and an enemy to truth, to be a slave to the fashions of the day as opposed to a seeker of what is good and what is right. This phenomenon doesn't just manifest in the form of war propaganda pushed by people that benefit from it directly. It also manifests in many different ways. It manifests in the form of being enshrined in the reality TV mindset where everything is drama and a fight and conflict. It also manifests in many ways in different forms of depression and hopelessness and nihilism. It also manifests in many ways through the cynicism that so many people have, that if you just get a good job and you just live in a white picket fence house and you just, get married before a certain age, life will be just dandy. It'll just be all right. If you just do X, Y, and Z, if you just go to college, after you went through all this government funded schooling and you were indoctrinated, you just go to college, you just get out, you get a good job, you get a good paycheck, you're in debt your whole life, everything will just be all dandy. That is the primary mentality that rules the minds of so many people today. It's a mentality that is even foreign to how America was in the 50s, less than 100 years ago. And yet it rules the mind of so many Americans today. And it's that cynicism produced by status that kills human potential. I say that we reject the military-industrial complex, not just by calling out endless wars and boondoggles that benefit no one but money and interest. Not just by calling out the society of status and by pointing at people like Nikki Haley who directly benefit from war because they're on the boards of certain companies. We do it by recognizing that no idea is too big to be challenged, and that if we accept certain constraints, we should be free to reevaluate even our most sacred of cows, because doing so can not only lead the individual person, but also lead the nation on a path of righteousness and flourishing. My friends, if you were touched by my message today, and if you support me and support my project here on this channel, like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. Be sure to donate to me. Got Patreon, got PayPal, got locals. All that information is in my comment section down below. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.